Hello folks, and welcome to our final video in our series on dovetails. Now if you've been following this from the beginning, you know in the first video we talked about the material prep work. Second video we did the layouts of the pins and tails. In the third video we did actually cutting out the dovetails with a saw and chisel using the pins first method. And now I'm going to show you some common problems and common fixes for your dovetails. Now I think if you've never done dovetails before and you tried it, probably your first issues were either it was too tight or it was too loose. So we'll come to that second. But if you've been following this video series and you tried it, I am hoping and assuming that you were able to make a successful dovetail in the fact that it fit together properly. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you take your dovetails and you put it together, you should have some resistance of it going down, but you shouldn't have to beat on it with a hammer or a block of wood. And then looking at the dovetail, we should have minimal gaps. Now, I am really pleased with how this one fits. It looks great in so many ways, but real close you can see that I have a small line or a small gap. Now, I'm not too worried about that because here's my first tip. As I put glue in this, I want to make sure that I get the glue on the sides of the pins, because the end grain, it's really not doing the most there. It's the edge grain here on the pins that does well. Now when I put this together, while that glue is still wet, what I like to do is take some sandpaper and I'll sand on that. What it's doing is it's causing the sawdust to fall into that gap, and it's making its own wood putty. And I prefer this versus buying a store-bought wood putty because sometimes you can get a difference in color. This is actually the same wood going into it. And now my gap is completely gone. Okay, so that's the first tip, but what if your gap isn't real small? What if it's a little bit bigger? Well, let's take a look at another example. Alright, so here's my second example of a gap. You can see on this board here that the top dovetail fits into the pins very nicely, but at the bottom there, I have a larger gap. And before I try and put clamps on this and wrench it down or try and fill it with glue or another method, what I want to do here is a little investigation. If you'll notice, on the edge here, my tail and pin is flush at the top, but it sticks out here just a little bit. And what that's telling me is that I probably have some wood down in there that's not removed. So let me take a look. Sure enough, I can see something in there, and I'll try and clean that out with a chisel. Let me try the fit again and see if we have a better result. Okay, well, at this point you can see I still have my gap there, but I'm more flush on the end. So I did have a little something in there to clear out, but I still have my gap, and I think that glue and sandpaper method is going to work just fine for this one. Now let me show you one that's even worse and how we'll fix that. Here's an example of a dovetail joint that went together well. I could feel pressure, but I have some gaps. So if we examine this closer, I have a gap down here, but it's tight up in the corner. And on this side, it's tight down in the bottom, but I have a gap at the top. All right, here's how I'm going to fix that. I'm going to take my saw, and I'm actually going to try and widen that gap. So this one's pretty easy. You got to be careful. You don't want to overcut. All right, and then this side. This one's going to be a little bit trickier. Okay. So, if you can see that, what I did was I tried to widen the gap, make them even and consistent spacing there. Now I'm going to take some wood shavings, preferably of the same material that you're working with, and I'm going to put some glue in the crack. And you have to act quickly here, because when the glue hits your wood shaving here, the water in the glue, it instantly wants to start to swell the wood fibers. And I'm folding my shaving over. Okay. There. I'm folding my shaving over because the thickness of just one of the shavings wasn't enough to fill the gap. So I folded over, got it in there. You can also do a trick where if you take your wood shaving and you really want it to swell, you can take a hammer and beat on the wood shaving, say like on the concrete or preferably a small little anvil. And what you'll do, you'll compress all those fibers. Then when you stick it in the gap, and again with the water in the glue, it's really going to cause that to swell, and you'll get a nice fitting shim in that space. Okay, now I'm going to let this dry a couple of minutes, and then I will cut them off with a knife, sand it, and we'll see what it looks like. It's dry and just a little bit of sanding on it, and I'll tell you what, you'd be hard-pressed to know that we stuck some shavings in there. Now, I do want to say one thing. It's tempting to want to, before the glue is dry, take your knife and cut the wood shavings off. And you'll be okay with that, but I like it to completely dry, because if I don't, that wet glue actually gets on the tip of my knife, and then when it does dry and I go to use it, it's not going to be as sharp as what I'm commonly used to. Okay, so that problem is solved. Let's take a look at now the issues that most people are probably going to run into their first times doing dovetails, and that's either too loose or too tight. And in this case, we're going to start with ones that are too tight. Now, here's one that I have to show. It was going together. I could feel the resistance, and that's something you're going to develop as you are doing the dovetails. You're going to be able to tell what's going to go and be a good fit and what's just a tad too much. And in this case, hopefully you can see, as I put it together, I've got a hairline crack starting at the half pin. That half pin is our weakest point of this, and so thereby it did go together, and I could probably still fill that in with some glue and clamps, but I really should have stopped and not pushed it all the way through. So here's an extreme example of how to fit a joint that is too tight. And so just as I normally go to put it together, I place the pins on top of the tails, and without a doubt I could use a sledgehammer on this. It's not going to go. And I purposely cut this one extra fat for this demonstration. So here's what I like to do. You have to get in real close and examine the fit. I can see it looks like this half pin is going to fit just fine. I can definitely tell that the center pin is not even starting, and it looks like this front half pin is going to hit too. So again, with my mechanical pencil, I'll go in here and I will trace my lines onto the tails, and I can clearly see I have nothing to take off this tail. I have a pretty heavy line on this side of the tail, a moderate line on this side, and again a moderate line on that side of the tail. Now, what I used to do, and I think what a lot of beginners will do, is they try and cut or pare away on this tail. And let me tell you, that is a mistake you're going to make, and what's going to happen is the line's not going to be straight anymore. You're going to break out on the other side, so the outside of it's not going to look good. It's too hard to get a saw started right on that edge. So what I do, based on those lines, that tells me that I have, and I like to use a fatter pencil at this point. I have to take some off of this side, and some on here. And I use a fatter pencil because that's going to, I'll be able to see a little bit easier how much material I need to remove. Now, what I use, again, is I don't try and use a chisel to pare that away. And I certainly wouldn't use a handsaw for that. This is where a good file comes into play. You can use the file and remove the material while keeping it flat against the whole edge of the pin. And that pencil line, well, that gives me a good indication of how much I've removed. If I can still see some lead from the pencil, I like to go a little bit more. And this is a process you're going to have to sneak up on. I guarantee you that this is not going to fit my first try, but I want to go slow and sneak up on it so I don't have one that has gaps or is too loose. Oh, look at that. It's going. It's still a little snug. It is still a little snug. I think I should use the file on it a tad bit more. But look at that. It did go. Not too bad there. So that's how I recommend that you sneak up, not on the tails, but on the pins. Get a good set of files. Make sure you have everything from fine to coarse. And of course, don't throw your files all in a drawer where they can roll around, because just like hand planes, just like chisels, when these teeth hit each other, they will dull. Okay, now let's move on to the worst one I've saved for you, a joint that is way too loose, and this is almost going to be ridiculous to show you, but at any rate, I'm going to show you a couple of things on how to fix this extremely loose-fitting dovetail. Here is my dovetails. I have my pins and tails, and as you can see, this requires no pressure at all to put it together. It's way too loose. It wiggles back and forth. There's just absolutely no resistance on this thing whatsoever. Besides being really loose, I don't know if this picks it up on the camera or not, but the pins and tails both are way too proud. They stick way past the edge of our side. So I'm going to show you how to fix both of these. So what I want to do is I need to make some shims. I could use the shavings, but I'm going to get a whole bunch of shavings packed in there, and it's not going to be all that great. What I need to do is make some shims. So I'll take some scrap wood from the project that we're doing. This way I make sure all the wood matches the same. And I'll put the wood in the vise, hang it over the edge, and split off some pieces. From there, though, the pieces probably, well, let's see. Let me see if I can get one. I probably shouldn't be doing this manner. I shouldn't be holding it like this. So you guys can see, and I don't have to move the cameras. So, okay, so there we go. I just split that off. And this is a really big piece, but you'll get the idea. With the bench hook, I can put that in there, and then with my chisel, pare down. And essentially I can get it right to a point. And so that's what I did for the 3 gaps that I'm looking at. So I'm going to set this up. All right, so I'm going to put some glue on this super sloppy joint. At this point, the glue wouldn't even be doing anything because there's such a void in between the pins and tails. But it will help for our wedges. Okay. So here are my wedges that I've made, and I'll put a little bit of glue on those. Stick that in there. That's one. Two. I think this other middle one might be okay. I think I could probably fill that in either with the shaving or possibly using the glue and sandpaper trick. Put the last wedge in up here. And see, and I like this because I now have, with the wedge, I have the exact same orientation as the board. So on the front of this, I'm getting the face grain of it, and on the top, I'm getting the edge grain. And again, I have to let this completely dry. I'll cut it off, and then I'll show you how we're going to deal with these tails and pins that are sticking out way too high. The wedges appear to be dry, and I'm ready to cut them off now. And I like to use this Irwin flush cutting saw. What's nice about this is I can cut on the board, whether it's these wedges or say like a dowel into a board. I can cut on the side of the board. It's going to cut the dowel or wedge, but it's not going to make any marks or minimal marks on my flat surface. The reason being is on these saws, now I'm not a saw expert, but these saws have very little to no set. In other words, that the teeth in the alignment, like a normal saw, they're going to be staggered and offset. And the distance between the two edges of it is what we call a kerf. It's the size of the gap that the saw leaves when it's done. And these with no set will leave very little kerf, and that's how they can do it without damaging it. Now, if you don't have one of these flush cutting saws, and I don't know what the price of this Irwin runs, I mean, if I had to guess, between $10 and $15, and it has where you can exchange the blade if it gets dull, but it's just a plastic handle. It's not like that's the expensive part of it, but it works really, really well. If you don't have one, what I've done out on job sites is I've took a regular saw, and then what I do is I'll build up on it some tape, and I keep putting layers of tape until I get to the thickness of the set on there, and I can test it to make sure it's not scratching the work surface, but it does cut what I need it to. All right, so let me cut these off. And what's pretty amazing about this saw is even if your glue's a little bit wet, I don't know how, but it doesn't clog or plug up to the teeth. It still keeps cutting even after it dries. I'm sure it's not the best, but nonetheless, it still will always cut. Great little saw. Okay, now, as I said, these are really set pretty proud, the pins and tails. I don't think I've ever made one this bad, but it was for exaggeration. So, there was a method out there that some woodworkers will tell you to purposely leave your tails and pins a little proud past the surface of the wood. And the reason for that was if you had the gaps in it, minor gaps, what you would do is you would take a ball peen hammer and you would rap on either the tail or the pin to flatten it but squish it out, and that was to fill in the gaps. I've never been a fan of that method. I won't say it won't work, but the term is called bishoping. And I wondered why it was called bishoping, so I had to ask my good buddy Dennis Laney, who is my go-to source of woodworking knowledge. And he believes it was a term because bishops in the Catholic religion were of prominence and status, so you would stand up tall, which would make sense that this is standing proud of the surface. He said there was also, too, that the Protestants who resented the church, they had a game called pretty much like a whack-a-mole, but it was a whack-a-bishop, and there was a puppet that would poke its hand up through holes, and the kids or the people would try and smack it. So I don't know if that's where the term comes from. That sounds pretty rough in my opinion. But at any rate, there's a little history behind the word that we use. It's called bishoping. But like I said, I don't like to use that method. If I have tails or pins that stand proud, I think most woodworkers would tell you to use your block plane and shave them down. Now when you're doing that, you have to make sure that your block plane is going into the material. Reason being is, if I was to bring the block plane across and coming off of it, well, what happens is these tails or pins are going to break out from the force and the direction, and then you're going to be left with some very ugly exterior looking dovetails. So you have to make sure that you're always going into it. Now, the block plane does a fantastic job for this, but we're going to run into another potential problem. As this plane works these pins and tails down to the surface of our board, as long as we are going with the direction of the grain of the board, like when we normally plane, we're going to have no problems. But keep in mind, if you're doing a box or a drawer, when you go to the other end, when you turn this around, if you were going with the grain, well, now you're going to be going against the grain, and you could really do some serious tear-out damage on it. So here's what I suggest. Versus a block plane and a regular blade in it, you can get a toothed blade. And a toothed blade is just that. It, instead of a flat edge going all the way across, it has a little teeth to it. And what this does then is it will not only take the tails and pins down, the end grain, but now when I hit my work surface, it's going to make small grooves in it. And those small grooves are easy to sand out with my final sanding then, versus having to deal with severe tear out. And the tooth plane works good going against the grain in that manner. And it's also excellent if you have highly figured wood, such as bird's eye maple or tiger wood, where you can have a lot of grain changing in it and can get a lot of tear out. The tooth blade works fantastic for that. And again, you're just left with a little bit of sanding when it's finished. This particular blade is IBC, but you can get just as good of one with Hock blades. They're available at Woodcraft. At any rate, if you don't have the means to get a blade, because they do cost a little bit of money, a good file or a good rasp is essential for doing this as well. Now this happens to be Shinto Rasp. You heard me talk about it on an episode earlier in this week, and if you didn't, I'll put that link below for you. But same thing, the rasp can go across and very quickly take down our pins and tails. There we are. I'm already flush, and if I start to scratch the surface of this board, again, sandpaper, and it cleans up. And that's going to come to my last point about bringing these down. I do not suggest using a belt sander, an orbital sander, any kind of palm sander for bringing these tails and pins down, because what tends to happen is we tend to lean or hang on that area too much, and what happens, we either round this corner or we thin the material out so much that it just isn't even pleasing to the eye anymore. It just really looks like you did a number on it. So, okay, there we are. Those are my common fixes and problems that you can come across in dovetails. I hope you enjoyed this series. If you did, please like it and share it. We work pretty hard at trying to come up with good, informative videos here for you so we can get better sponsors to make better material for you so you can become a better woodworker. And I'll tell you what, if you haven't followed the series, please pick it up. Try doing your dovetail if it's your first time, and send me a photo of your very first dovetail at stantonfinefurniture@gmail.com. I would love to see it, and I highly recommend that you save your first dovetail. I have my first dovetail on a box that I made. It's terrible, it's hideous, it's embarrassing, but I can look at it and see my growth and how much I've come along in this process. And I think you'll find that it'll work wonders for you too. You don't have to show anyone if you don't want. Go ahead and hide it. But you'll see in a real short time, you will master dovetails. So until next time, join us on Monday where we have videos talking about you and what you're making in your shop. Then on Wednesdays, I answer viewer email questions, talk a little bit about products, and tell you what I'm doing in my shop. And then, of course, right back here again on Friday, either for a quick tip, a series, or a project video. So until then, keep on dancing.